The sitting is resumed. Any speakers? Senator Andrelli Boyce.
Good afternoon, Mr. President. Thank you for recognizing me. I stand in support of the resolution before the chamber, Mr. President, because in very real terms, over the last few years, the ship of Barbados has been battered by a number of things. COVID, ashfall, ELSA, and a number of international developments that have constrained the space that small island developing states like Barbados have to operate. But through it all, the ship has never lost its rudder, Mr. President. And so the plan to keep Barbados afloat has always been one we can depend on. So that this BERT 2022, in this BERT 2022, the government has outlined how it intends to increase growth through a dedicated growth strategy, and particularly through the improving of our services sector, specifically by transforming the way government services are delivered with a view to increasing domestic outputs and global competitiveness, Mr. President, all while maintaining a focus on improving the lives of the average citizen. Sir, our economic growth is inextricably linked to our ability to improve the provision of services in this country, and more specifically, improve business processes and to make better the ease of doing business for the average citizen, for business people, for investors, both local and international. And so the plan before us makes it clear that improved service delivery is imperative to mechanizing growth and transforming the country. The government has recognized that efficient service delivery and rooting out the perennial issues of the public sector, that attitude that we all complain about of do it if you want, when you want, only if you want, in too many institutions is critical to moving the country forward. And so, Mr. President, the reform agenda, particularly the digitization of government services, the creation of e-windows for the delivery of government services, is critical, Mr. President. Earlier in the chamber, we heard the now former chair of the Barbados Port Inc., our colleague, the Honourable Senator Cummins, talk about improving operations at the port. And there is no better person to take you through the improvement of trade facilitation as an imperative to the country's development than Senator Cummins. And the program, BERT 2022, privileges trade facilitation as an important element of moving the country forward and of boosting economic activity. As part of this thrust, Mr. President, there will also be a focus on exports in which Barbados has a comparative advantage through a focus on innovation, science, and technology. It is necessary to position the country as one defined by innovative products and services, Mr. President. The modern trade environment requires that we increase our inputs to the value chain. We increase our inputs to the value chain, thereby creating greater benefit for exporters and citizens of this country. Along those lines, the government has committed to enhancing the manufacturing capacity of the country. The BERT 2022 says by 50%, and is setting aside acres, Mr. President, with a view to providing space, because again, one of the perennial issues in the trade sector and in the manufacturing sector specifically has been the constraints many of our exporters and investors face in relation to the spaces to occupy, to do their work in, and to create their exports, Mr. President. And so this is a forward-looking policy aimed at ensuring that at all levels, at the level of government, service delivery, and at the level of our manufacturing sector, that there is space for the use of innovative policy to respond to the realities of this country, Mr. President. One of the other things that is a through line of BERT 2022 is the green pathways that throughout this policy the government has created to ensure that Barbados is green and sustainable, not only in relation to renewable energy, although that is an important element of the plan, but also in relation to, again, the provision of services. We know well that Barbados has the largest stock of electric buses in the region. We know well that the plan in relation to housing, to house 10,000 people across various economic brackets, and to provide an opportunity for homeowners through the use of renewable energy to earn, Mr. President, is an important element of what we're doing. And there was a time in this country, Mr. President, as you would know, when the aim was about housing Barbadians and housing Barbadians alone. But again, in this modern environment, the government has found space to respond to the realities of the world. The realities of the world, Mr. President, in this respect, defined by an over-reliance on fossil fuels. And so we're encouraging through this policy Barbadians to get involved in the renewable energy thrust.
Are you sure, Senator, that those are not special sound effects coming from either the clerks or myself?
Further, Mr. President, there is a thrust in the manufacturing policy, again, to create free economic zones and to ensure that the exports and the products created in those spaces are green and renewable. And again, a through line of our investment strategy is to ensure that that which we export and the investment that we attract to the island is sustainable and green, Mr. President, so that the BERT Plan 2022 does not negate or leave out our sustainable development goals, does not leave out or compromise the global advocacy of this country in that space, and is aimed at mechanizing the development of this country through tools and techniques aimed at sustainability. This, Mr. President, is innovative and new because you and I both know that there has long been a complaint, particularly about FDI and the realities, if you will, that traditional FDI investment is not always good for our environment, that the traditional businesses we attract have not always been good for our environment. And while there is a thrust by the government to get those traditional players to take measure of their impact on the environment and to improve their processes, there's also a move afoot, Mr. President, as articulated in the BERT program, to attract clean and green investment to the country. I want to take the opportunity, although I have spoken about investors, I want to take the opportunity to encourage average Barbadians to get involved in the thrust towards renewable energy. We only combat the realities of fossil fuel over-reliance if all of us, if not only at the level of the state, but also at the level of the average citizen, we get involved through purchasing a fossil fuel car, which the government has indicated, and this plan has indicated, is going to be in some ways tax-free and tariff-free. And then, Mr. President, there is, like I indicated, the policy in relation to housing that we want persons to take advantage of across income brackets. All of this, Mr. President, is evidence of an understanding that, and the Prime Minister has said it recently, while we may not impact on our own the fossil fuel over-reliance, we have to do what we can to make this country better, to make it cleaner, to make it greener, to make it more sustainable. Mr. President, any growth strategy, and any growth strategy created in this moment, a moment post-COVID, a moment defined by the Ukraine war, has to have at its center the people of Barbados, and I believe this strategy does. And the pillars in which that is evident, where that is evident rather, is in education and training, the development and success, I would say, of the National Transformation Initiative in training thousands of Barbadians through their partnership with Coursera, but through their homegrown and indigenous courses as well, to meet global needs and to respond to global realities is something that cannot be discounted. And it is imperative, Mr. President, because the World Bank, the IMF, international development organizations generally suggest to us that upskilling and democratizing the access to skills and skills development is going to be an important pillar in any small island developing state's recovery. That the thrust and success of the National Transformation Initiative, Mr. President, and the construction gateway cannot be extricated from the larger educational reform agenda, and again, providing opportunities through the reform of what is a rather antiquated traditional education system to providing persons with the skills that they need. And then there is the reform. People are also at the center of the reforms associated with the development of what is to be the Family Services Authority, the Family Services Department. Mr. President, grow all you will, and we certainly hope that Barbados grows economically. There will be vulnerable people whom this country has to respond to, who this country in the development of its policy has to make space for. And so the idea of a reformed social services department that provides a set of comprehensive services that reduces stigma, that increases efficiency, is a step in the right direction. And added to that, the legislative thrust of this government to ensure the legal protections of vulnerable people, whether they be persons with disabilities, the elderly, and children, Mr. President, all part of ensuring the provision of social services and the appropriate provision of social services, even as we set about on this growth strategy. Mr. President, the realities of this country, our size in relation to the rest of the world, our relative impact compared to the rest of the world, makes it so that we must steady ourselves, we must respond, we must ensure resilience, and we must commit ourselves in whatever ways to ensuring that the project and promise of Barbados is stability, Mr. President. And I think this BERT plan, as a live document, as a living document representing both the plans and ambitions of this country, does exactly that. And it is in that context that I commend it to this chamber, and with those few words, I'm obliged to you.
Thank you very much, Senator Andrelli Boyce. Senator Dr. Brathwaite.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I raise to comment on the current proposals which have been presented to us today. And I wish to begin by commending Senator Lisa Cummins for her eloquent presentation this morning, which I think sets the stage for analysis and for comment on the document which is before us. Mr. President, I would like to think of the BERT program, BERT 2, or BERT 2022, that has been presented to us today as a platform for the future, not as something for 2022 or for 2023 or for 2024 or even for 2025. I would like to believe that the government is presenting to us a platform that helps to define the long-term development of our country, and that sets the stage for growth and economic prosperity going forward. Because, Mr. President, it cannot be that we are seeing our country in a dependency dimension for the long term, but that one that will, with time, evolve to be a prosperous and successful small island development state among the countries of the world. And therefore, I would like to think, Mr. President, that this is a platform for the future and not a platform for today. Mr. President, the turbulent social, economic, and political times in which we live demands of us the need for a new stance, a new approach to address the challenges of our own sustainability. The imperatives are not and cannot be based on the true and tested strategies of the past, but must be grounded and developed in the context of innovative approaches to treat with the challenges of our time for the future. The COVID pandemic, the events of the recent past expose our vulnerability in ways that they were never exposed before. Our vulnerability to changing climate, our vulnerability to the pandemic, and our vulnerability to global conflict. We stand, therefore, at a new moment in time, characterized by uncertainty and unpredictability. I believe, sir, that the BERT program before us will provide the basic elements for a new beginning. That new beginning, in my view, should include strategies to eradicate poverty from Barbados and promote more individual responsibility. Mr. President, globally, 200 million people who were not in poverty before COVID have gone into poverty. Getting people out of poverty, therefore, must be an objective of a post-COVID agenda. The elimination of poverty and the promotion of individual responsibility must be a characteristic of our time. In the section of the document on social development, social security, and poverty eradication, I note that the government has taken cognizance of the need to recognize the impact of COVID, along with climate-related shocks on our population, and the impact that it has caused an increase in the population that is now below the poverty line. The programs proposed to address these issues in the areas of housing, in the areas of strengthening healthcare facilities, and streamlining the social services provided by the National Assistance Board, the Child Care Board, and the Welfare Department are noble initiatives. But government cannot forever support all of those who need this assistance. Therefore, the elimination of poverty and the promotion of strategies for individual responsibility become important looking to the future. Because, Mr. President, just think of the cost of social support and social contribution in the long term and the impact that this is going to have on our financial resources. I therefore believe, Mr. President, that the time has come for the development and implementation of specific strategies to eliminate poverty from Barbados. Around the world, many countries are now including poverty eradication as part of their development agenda. And I refer to two countries, Brazil and China, that have made major advances in reducing the level of poverty in their countries over the last decade or so. I think it's appropriate that we should examine what these countries are doing and look at their strategies. Everything that they do may not be relevant to our circumstances, but clearly, Mr. Chairman, an examination of what they're doing to eliminate and eradicate poverty is something that we must be cognizant of, especially in the case of China, which has reduced poverty in that country by some 800 million over the last 20 years. Eradicating poverty in all its forms remain one of the greatest challenges facing humanity. The United Nations has prioritized the eradication of poverty among the Sustainable Development Goals to be achieved by 2030. And I believe that one of the fundamental objectives in the context of our long-term development must be the eradication of poverty from our country. We must see this strategy not only in the context of focusing on the middle class, but focusing on those who are less endowed in our country, the poor and the vulnerable of our society, closing the gap between the haves and the have-nots, developing a strategy to make this country more socially equitable. Such a goal and the implementation of the same would ensure that the poor and vulnerable have equal rights to economic resources, access to basic services, including education, health care, and strategies to provide greater access to housing, land, educational opportunities, appropriate technology, and financial resources, including finances for entrepreneurship and for developing that sense of independence, individual independence, by getting involved in more entrepreneurial activities. It is important to recognize that poverty can be the source of many ills in our society, including things like domestic violence, antisocial behavior, crime, malnutrition, poor infrastructure, social tensions that threaten to divide the nation into the haves and the have-nots. In addition, Poverty supports the prevalence of disease, poor health, and low productivity, creates anxiety and depression, low self-esteem. All evidence of this that affects especially our children. It stunts their physical growth and development. Poverty hinders social and emotional development and shortens life expectancy. Poverty inflates infant and child mortality, increases the likelihood of children with chronic health problems. Poverty creates and perpetuates and widens the social gaps in our country. Poverty increases parent stress and creates tension in the home. Poverty introduces hunger, neglect, insecurity, and instability. Poverty increases violence. Children personally experience and witness. In a recent report, the Inter-American Development Bank showed that some 7,000 households in Barbados were in poverty, and that represented, according to the same report, 35,000 persons, classified at that time as living below the poverty line. Those numbers might have increased as a result of COVID. Given the fact, Mr. President, that there's some 100,000 households in Barbados, then 7,000 households would just be about 7% of our population. In the context of global figures, this is a low level of poverty when compared to many of the countries in the developing world. In that context, the figure is low, and it should not be beyond us, therefore, in this 21st century, in a world of global prosperity, to end poverty in Barbados. Colleagues, we will not reach our development goals and the noble plans if one part of our society lives in material prosperity and the other part lives in poverty. A strategy of poverty reduction and elimination implies that we will pursue people-centered development strategies that will improve infrastructure, housing, entrepreneurship, and access to capital and markets for the vulnerable of our society. Not only to give them a handout, not only to give them a fish, but teach them to fish so that they can support themselves. Let, therefore, Mr. President, the elimination of poverty be a development objective of Barbados, and let Barbados be the first small island developing state to eliminate poverty in this world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Dr. Brathwaite. Senator Drix.
Good afternoon, Mr. President, and to my colleagues that are present and in the chamber, and to all those who can hear my voice. Mr. President, we are now at BERT 2.0. That's what I like to call it, BERT 2.0. And yes, we've had a lot of discussion regarding the level of debt that the country has incurred over the last, particularly last 4 years. And by and large, that is to be expected. The Barbadian public is one that is usually engaged with these types of matters, and you will expect that kind of discourse to happen. BERT 2022, or 2.0, as I said, that I call it, over the next 4 years is seeking to gain financing of the tune of about $2 billion. And we know that a large chunk of this is coming from the International Monetary Fund, Mr. President, the IMF, through another extended fund facility and through the Resilience and Sustainability Trust. And as I listen to the concerns, the various sides by which persons say, you know, we should not be borrowing more money, and then you have persons saying you don't have a choice but to borrow more money based on the economic circumstances, and all the other points of view in between that spectrum, I usually try to think about what's not being said. What's not being said in the conversation. And one of the things that I find that is not being said is we're talking about debt, but why do we have the debt? Why is Barbados in debt? What is causing us to have to go to the local market? What is causing us to have to go to the international financial institutions to accumulate this debt? And there are two economic indicators that are important when we're speaking about debt and possibly the root cause. The first is the fiscal balance, which is government's revenue in relation to its expenditure, and the current account balance. My colleague on the other side spoke about the trade balance a few moments ago. And the current account balance is how much inflows of foreign exchange, which we usually call exports, versus the outflows, what we know are what we call the imports. And both of these indicators, on any given year in our history, Mr. President, they're negative. The fiscal balance or the fiscal deficit, and then the current account is usually negative. And that is customary, usually for a small island developing state like Barbados, who has limited resources on the local side, and then who's also a net importer. And because of that context, you have to finance those two deficits, those twin deficits, by seeking some type of financing. And that is just the harsh reality, because sometimes we get a little ahead of ourselves in rhetoric, but the fact is, Barbados at the moment cannot sustain its fiscal operations without financing, and it cannot sustain all of the luxuries that we've come to love without financing. Mr. President, the government can do some things on the fiscal side in terms of fiscal policy to reduce the deficit. We know those things, such as raising taxes, and nobody wants their taxes to be raised, or they can cut expenditure. Nobody wants to go home. We want to keep the wage bill as is, and we know the social implications for sending home individuals. Or, as we've seen before, we can borrow from the local market, or we have to go to the international market. The current account, Mr. President, is a bit more difficult in terms of its management, because by and large, we don't produce a lot of the things that we import here in Barbados. And we've made very little inroads in trying to reduce the import bill. And when persons, if you want to have a look of how the import bill is structured, go to the central bank report, and it's in the appendix under balance of payments. And when you look at the statistics, I know people talk about energy in terms of our oil imports, our energy imports. We talk about food a lot. But take a look at the merchandise. All other merchandise imports, Mr. President, year on year, it is over $1 billion. And those are the cold, hard facts, Mr. President. Since 2007, Mr. President, going back to the fiscal deficits, we've had extremely large deficits, year on year. 2013 was the largest. We had $958 million in a fiscal deficit for that financial year. The current account balance has declined in terms of its deficit since 1995, Mr. President. The largest deficits in recent history were in 2014, where we had a current account deficit of $860 million. And then in 2021, where it was $1 billion, that's with a B, $1 billion. And we understand because of what happened in 2021, why that would have been to that extreme due to the COVID pandemic. And in the latest central bank report, our current account deficit was, as of September, $967 million. Mr. President, we do not earn the money to support these types of deficits. And sir, these shortfalls basically cause the government to have to intervene in a way that allows for us to have some type of stability in the country. As I said earlier, nobody wants their taxes to be raised. And I'm sure if the government gets up tomorrow and says, and this is completely hypothetical, that we have to send home civil servants, people will be in an uproar. So what gives? Because something has to give. We cannot have it all. And I know it is not politically sexy, but I have not heard of any administration, maybe I'm too young and green, but I've not heard any administration get on any political platform and say that they're introducing trade quotas or embargoes. It is political suicide. It is political suicide, but we have to find a way to resolve this issue, because once we continue to run these deficits, we have to seek financing for it. So Barbadians have to look in the mirror, all of us across the spectrum, excluding those who cannot satisfy their basic needs. And I want to say this publicly today. We have to really ask ourselves, what is it that we're willing to give up? Because on one hand, we don't want to be burdened years down the line with debt financing. But in the short term, we want to have all the material consumption that comes from outside. And we do not make enough money from our main sector, which is tourism, to finance the type of importation that we have year on year. So where do we go? What do we do, Mr. President? And I think that is something, it is an uncomfortable reality. It is something that the political class may not want to say, but when you look at the hard, cold facts of it, and you look at the data, that is where we're at. And if the public is saying they don't want, by and large, to take on more debt, then where, in terms of either fiscal policy or trade policy, where are we going to get the compromise, Mr. President? So essentially, we have a situation in Barbados where we're using borrowed money to support our lifestyle. That's it. So are we willing to give up what we've become accustomed to become more self-reliant and more self-sufficient and live within our means? And I know people will get a bit antsy about that given the current climate and the rate of inflation and the cost of living and everything else. But at some point, this reality, and I think that point has passed, I think that point happened in COVID, but we have to become very sober-minded in what it means to run Barbados, to run these large current account deficits, and the implications that it has for policy and policy making, Mr. President. But, sir, that was just my sobering introduction. Moving on to some specifics and observations that I read in the BERT 2022 program. And one of the key things that I gleaned from the report is the program is being hinged on a key target of a debt to GDP of 60%, debt to GDP of 60%, and reducing our debt profile down to 60%. And a lot of that is going to be based on increasing investment, by and large, in the short to medium term, because as we know, exports take time to get up and running and to produce, to sell to the international market. And one of the major aims is to increase investment as a percentage of GDP to about 29 to 30%, which is a very large amount, very ambitious, Mr. President. And when we break it down in terms of public investment, foreign direct investment, and local private investment, we are aiming for public investment about 5% between 2023 and 2027, foreign direct investment of about 9% in that same time period, and then local private investment about 15% of GDP. And it is ambitious in terms of what the government is trying to do in terms of increasing gross domestic product through investment. But I am a little conservative in terms of what I think is achievable in the time frame. Mr. President, we are talking about increasing public sector investment to about $500 million each year, on average in that time period. We are talking about, to put some real numbers to this, the private sector investment, $1.9 billion on average until 2027. Foreign direct investment, 9% of GDP, averaging $1.1 billion per year on average. And I like to put things into context because telling me that is your target, I then start to think about, okay, has this been done before? Is this something that is achievable? Since 1975, when I looked at foreign direct investment in particular, we've only had a foreign direct investment above 10% of GDP in 8 years, since 1975, 2005, 2007, 2008, 2011, 12, 14, 15, and 16, Mr. President. And a lot of that investment, Mr. President, was in what we call the lost decade. So the lost decade still has some lessons to be learned because the government is now seeking to raise investment levels, particularly foreign direct investment, to the levels that they were during a decade that we called it was lost. And I say that to say because in that document, that rhetoric based on a national plan, Mr. President, I thought was unnecessary. I understand the politics behind it, but if we're talking about an economic development, a national economic development plan for Barbados, there's no reason to call it a lost decade. That's my personal opinion. Because there are things that we can still learn from that decade. It is not lost. But I really want to ask, so, Mr. President, if we're being realistic with that investment rate of about 30% of GDP. I say that on the backdrop of, as we've heard earlier, increasing interest rates globally. We see many of the large financial institutions being very conservative with their balance sheets and their portfolios, and we are being told that the world is moving towards a recessionary period. Even the IMF and their own outlook, their World Economic Outlook, anticipates that, and I quote, 2023 will feel like a recession for millions around the world. It states that the risks remain unusually large. Monetary policy could miscalculate, and when they're talking about monetary policy, for those who are listening to me, they're talking about the increase in the interest rate by the Federal Reserve in the US and the Bank of England in the UK. And that monetary policy could miscalculate the right stance to reduce inflation because everybody across the globe is dealing with high inflation rates. This is not unique to Barbados. And it goes on to say that divergent policy passed in the largest economies could exacerbate US dollar appreciation. Tightening global financing could trigger emerging market distress. and a worsening of China's property sector crisis could undermine growth. And that, as we've heard in other contributions so far, Mr. President, is the makeup and the landscape that we're looking at going into BERT 2022. So, Mr. President, when I read the document, I asked this question: does the program that the government is looking to embark on, does it make us more resilient in the event than in a scenario that is worse than expected? That's something that is up for question. Does it make us more resilient in a worse than expected global environment? Mr. President, and I say that on the backdrop of, since the 1970s, every major recession, Barbados has ran into economic difficulty. In 1975, in 1982, in 1991, we all know by 1992, we went to the IMF under a standby arrangement. We know what happened in the 2008 recession. And then by 2009, we started to see the implications of that, and then obviously in 2020. Every single major recession. And what we're dealing with now is a pandemic-induced global recession, further exacerbated by a geopolitical-induced global recession that is upcoming based on predictions. So how are we faring in an environment where there's a global recession in less than 5 years, back to back? 2 global recessions in less than 5 years, Mr. President. And there are a number of other threats that we've heard that compound the situation. One, Mr. President, is the massive debt levels across the globe. What people are calling the looming global debt crisis. That is a major concern that is being placed on the table by economists and analysts across the world. Mr. President, since the 1970s, in the 1970s, the total debt stock of the world was about 100% of global GDP. By 2001, it was 200% of GDP. And as of last year, 2021, the number is now 350% of global GDP. Global debt to GDP is at 350%. In advanced economies, it is about 420%. These numbers are unprecedented, Mr. President. And, sir, it is being perpetuated because every time a government across the world gets into problems, they borrow and they issue debt. So what we have is governments basically taking financing to steal growth from the future to satisfy the needs of now. I'll say that again. What we have at the moment, because of the debt crisis, is governments stealing growth from the future to satisfy the needs of now. And Mr. President, just to put this into context, it is now known that the level of debt that we have across the world has never been seen in world history. Sir, what is also going to be a part of how government navigates the BERT 2020-22 program is the rise of populism and nationalism across the globe because of the pushback on the globalization experiment. We've seen many countries start to look inwardly, start to seek out ways by which people at home are cared for first, rather than seeking to expand in terms of the globalization movement. And that will have trade implications as well. That will have implications for protectionist policies going forward. The geopolitical tensions also do not augur well for us as a small island developing state when these large countries, these large producers start to withhold goods, Mr. President, from the rest of the world to satisfy their local citizens. Mr. President, we may find ourselves in a situation where the food shortages or the supply shortages that we see now only increase. And Mr. President, when I rise to stand in here, a lot of the times I speak of the climatic impacts. But today I will not even mention those because that in and of itself, we know what that means for Barbados in terms of increased vulnerability and disaster management and loss and damage. So, in essence, what I'm trying to say, placing these things into the debate, is that for the targets that I see under the program, from my position and my standpoint, Mr. President, when I look at the numbers, they seem a bit favorable in terms of the outlook and what can be achieved. And if we can expound on, how embedded in the program, there's certain safety mechanisms, certain risk mitigation involved. If a worst case scenario happens globally, then by all means, Mr. President, I welcome that. So I want to make another observation here today, and it is in relation to growth. It is in relation to growth. And much of the new program is underpinning growth in terms of the digital economy, the knowledge-based economy, and also building out the blue and green transition. And that is what is to be expected. That is the right thing to do, Mr. President. But I want to also state that Barbados and the rest of the Caribbean have been known for implementation deficit. And the devil is always in the details when it comes to major projects and policies that buck against the status quo. Mr. President, a perfect example of this we can look at, and it's not necessarily the entity, but the Barbados Port Authority in terms of customs reform. We came to this chamber, this honorable chamber, I believe it was in 2018 or 2019, for Asakuda 2019, in terms of the reforms for the Asakuda world and the implementation. And it was supposed to give us a direct benefit in terms of the ease of doing business, in terms of the customs operations. But I do not have the official figures, and this is purely based on anecdotal reporting, but it seems as though the implementation of that system, the processing is taking longer. And I'm not sure if it is a technological problem. I do not know if it is a logistical problem. I don't know if it's an operational problem, but somehow it seems to be a public outcry that now that this new technology has been implemented, Mr. President, things are taking longer to be cleared in the port. And that is just one example in terms of when implementation seems to go wrong and we do not hit the mark in terms of what the project is supposed to benefit, or what the benefits that the project is supposed to give to the country. So when we talk then about the various projects that the government has on its agenda, when we look at the Marine Spatial Plan, Mr. President, in the blue economy, when we're talking about going to carbon neutrality by 2030 and all the engineering implications that has in terms of the capacity on the grid and changing out into batteries and et cetera, when we're talking about 10,000 homes being built in 5 years, Mr. President, and creating all these new niche areas to support growth, I am cautionary because it is always in the implementation where things go wrong or go awry. And the other thing, Mr. President, I want to mention here is capacity. The government has a very large and extensive agenda. It is no small feat what is trying to be achieved. And do we have the capacity? I mean, there's simple things we have to ask sometimes. Do we have the capacity to implement, sustain, and monitor all of the things that the administration wants to do in terms of human resources? Because there are many of these areas that require specialized work, and those persons, many of them I know in the public sector, who are already overworked, Mr. President. So sometimes it may come down to simply a capacity issue in terms of reaching your objectives. So those are the kinds of things that when I read the BERT 2022 program, that I make my notes and I think about in terms of, what does this look like on the ground in the day-to-day execution. But sir, my last observation is in the area of social transformation. Social transformation. And unlike most economists, I do not talk about growth extensively. Because growth must be for a purpose. It must be for a purpose. And that purpose is usually what we call development, when you bring it to its logical conclusion. Sir, does BERT 2022, through you, Mr. President, does BERT 2022 truly change the class and wealth structure of Barbados? Those are the questions that I ask when I read documents like this. Because sometimes we can talk about placing economic opportunities out there in various areas, but if the persons that do not have the means, they do not have the capital, they do not have the resources to participate, if just by their own circumstances they're denied access to these opportunities, then the persons who do have the ability to participate continue to benefit in a way that creates the inequalities that Senator Brathwaite spoke about just now. Sir, to put this into perspective, the single most defining social policy that Barbados has ever had was free education, instituted by the first Prime Minister of Barbados, the Right Excellent Walton Barrow. So if we look at the movement from the sugar industry and agriculture to tourism and services, it was the underlying opportunities through free education that allowed tens of thousands of Barbadians, generation after generation, to then be able to participate in that economic pie. And I'll say something here that may be controversial now. Since that has been instituted 50 plus years ago, Mr. President, and I call it a social disruptor because it moved persons from one type of standard of living to another. It allowed for social mobility. So it was a social disruptor. And then coupled with the economic opportunities, then we had the various types of development that we had across Barbados. Have we now plateaued in terms of what free education does in terms of social transformation? have we plateaued in that policy direction? And I'll tell you why I'm asking this question. Because we've moved to a stage where we have a very large middle class, mainly consumers, as I spoke about earlier in terms of the importation bill. Most of them are holders of debt, and they're not really and truly able to add or create true value added to themselves or the country. And that shows up in things like the underemployment of university graduates, the inability to get jobs that are aligned to the skill set that certain people have in Barbados, or the unemployment in our youth. So when we look across the landscape in terms of the trajectory of development, what do we have to do in education or by some other means, because it may not be education that we need now to move us to the next stage of development. It may not be education, but what is it in BERT 2022 that will have the same effect that allows tens of thousands of Barbadians to improve their standard of living and create value added for themselves and this country, Mr. President? Sir, I want to share some statistics with you before I sit. And this is to kind of wrap up what I'm saying here in terms of social transformation. Sir, the working class in Barbados since 2006 has seen the growth rate in wages decline. Not stagnate, decline. In 2006, the rate of wages declined from 5%. In 2018, it was 1%. That is on the backdrop of inflation now being at 7.8%. So you can see the disparity in terms of where wages are versus the cost of living. Very easily, 1%, 7%. A shortfall of about 6%. So the pain that people are feeling on the ground is real. It is in the statistics. And the question has to be, how do we get those people who earn wages to participate more and create value added? And on top of that, Mr. President, if we're saying to them, yes, they have money in the credit union, they have money in the banking service, the savings rate there is 0.15%. So any rate of return on whether it's their employment that they're giving for labor in terms of going to work, or whether it's their savings, Mr. President, the rate of return on what they are earning, the working class in Barbados, Mr. President, is minuscule, I'm sure, in relation to big business and the profits that they're making. Mr. President, Sir Arthur Lewis, in his seminal writings on industrial development and the unlimited surplus of labor, made an observation about these types of characteristics in a society and an economy and its relation to development. And I just want to paraphrase here. In his observation, he stated that what we are trying to do, which is grow the economy by investment, yeah? We have to focus on those who save more and persons of high income. He concluded that in order to increase savings in relation to national income has to be done with respect to being cognizant of the rate of return on profits. And I'll say that again, and probably in simpler terms. The rate by which your wages in a country increase in relation to growing an economy through investment to increase national income must be done cognizant of the rate of return on profits. Because exactly what Senator Brathwaite spoke about in terms of the class disparity, because you have the working class earning or even having a decrease in what they earn versus those who have the capital and who have the resources making higher returns on profits, creates these large disparities. And that is where class and development intertwine. So Barbados needs to be very careful when we march on into the renewable energy sector, when we march on into the blue economy, when we march on into the digitization, into the knowledge-based economy, and all these other areas. We have to be cognizant, Mr. President, what is it that the average earner is making in those sectors versus the people who own capital. And if, Mr. President, at any point we do not address the disparity, then that is where we will continue to uphold the sordid past that we came from, where the plantocracy was the order of the day, Mr. President, and those of a particular class and race, in some instances, held on to what were the means of production and capital accumulation. So, sir, I would just say to the government to be sober-minded about some of the things that I've asked this afternoon. And I know that it is something that is possibly spoken about within the bosom of the government and the cabinet. But when we look at what is happening in terms of certain indicators, there's a clear disparity and a widening of inequality that is happening despite growth. And growth is not, as I said, an end in and of itself, but it has to be that it breaks down the strongholds of the class structure, and it has to be development for all, Mr. President. And with those words, I'm obliged to you.
Thank you very much, Senator Drake. Senator Dr. Hines.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. President. This has been a lot to take in. I really have enjoyed and appreciated what I have heard so far. On the Barbados Economic Recovery Transformation Plan 2022, I have so much to say. This is a really significant document because it is so expansive. I categorize this in the area of development planning, and Barbados is a country that has consistently done development planning and has provided development planning documents since independence. In the 21st century, I can note the ones that some of us may probably be more familiar with, the 2006 to 2025 National Strategic Plan for Barbados. And then after that, we had the Barbados Medium Term Growth Development Strategy 2013 to 2020. You know, the dates overlap because when we have changes in government, the new government will come up with its own development plan. I put this in this category. I note that we had a previous BERT 2018, but then we had to recalibrate because we had a COVID-19 pandemic. So it is reasonable to expect that there needed to be some adjustment. So this is a good thing. It is very difficult to do anything without a plan. We need to plan. If we don't have a plan, we don't know where on earth we are going. This is a very ambitious plan. The BERT 2018 was ambitious as well, and in this document before us today, in summarizing the BERT 2018, it also notes that BERT 2018 was ambitious. And it is indeed good to be ambitious. We have to reach for the stars. It is important to reach high. And you might not get exactly where you reach, but if you're reaching low, you might not get there either. So it is better to be ambitious. I agree with these things. I hope that we can have some sobriety while we are ambitious as well. And we can recognize some of the things that Senator Cummins noted, which are these crises. And I was starting to wonder if she had read something. There is a very, if I do say so myself, a very informative piece called From Crisis to Crisis, Conundrums of Caribbean Existence in the Global Political Economy, published in January 2022 by one Christina Hines. That I think prior to the 19th of January, I should know as well, that might be quite informative in thinking about this. And I would say that this is not something that is new to us in the region. So if we look at the Caribbean, if we look at Barbados in particular, you will see that we are accustomed to crises. Looking specifically at, so in the 1980s, we had a debt crisis as well. Early 1990s, another crisis. 2001, not as long-lived, but we had the consequences of September 11th. 2008-9, we had a global financial crisis. So it is reasonable to expect that around every 10 years, you're looking for a crisis. And if we consider Barbados, one of the things that is really positive about the country, for all of the things we can talk about and complain about, is that the country has bounced back. It has gone through some very rough patches. We have experienced a lot of experimentation with how to address these crises. Sometimes we responded not as well as we should have, but Barbados has performed relatively well, and we see this reflected in things such as our Human Development Indicator rankings that continue to place us as having high human development. So if we want to look on the bright side of all of the turbulence that we have experienced, we can see that there are some positive things that Barbados, when compared to other countries in this region, in this hemisphere, if we look at Latin America, for instance, has been a lot more stable when it comes to coming out of these crises. Not perfect, we know that, we know, but it has been a lot more stable. If we want to think about going to the IMF, Barbados has gone to the IMF before as well. 1982 to 1983, a stabilization program, following which the country returned to 2 to 4% growth. We went to the IMF program, as we know, 1991 to 93, and we are in one now. We know the recent history. So this is not something that is new to Barbados. There may be some who are averse to going to the IMF, and when I hear the term lost decade, in my mind, from when I was a student, the lost decade generally referred to the decade from 1980 to 1990, 1989 or thereabouts. I note the 1980s, The Lost Decade, Development in Reverse by Hans Singer, published in 1989, as well as Lost Decades, Developing Country Stagnation in Spite of Policy Reform, 1980 to 1998. When you come from a development studies background, when we hear about the lost decade, this is what we are talking about generally. And these discussions tend to talk about the difficulties of countries going to the IMF in the 1980s because of the structural adjustment programs that countries were required to enter when going to the IMF. And the IMF is often linked to this decade being lost, some of the requirements. So for me, I find it's a kind of interesting use of lost decade. I also recall that people talk about the 1990s as a lost decade in Japan. I hear we have a lost decade now in Barbados too. The United Nations recently in a 2021 report indicated some concern that this decade from 2021 for the next 10 years may also be a lost decade because of the vagaries of the COVID-19 pandemic and the way in which it set countries back. I say all of this to get to the point that We are accustomed to experience, as I've said already, we're accustomed to experiencing crises. We're accustomed to planning. And in our planning, I think it is very important for us to recognize that there is always a crisis on the horizon. And we can even say that we are living in constant crisis now because of the threats of climate change. So we have to bear these things in mind when we set targets for ourselves, as ambitious as we want to be. So when we set growth targets, when we set targets for debt, I think we have to be very aware in our context, Barbados as well as the wider Caribbean, that these things are all contingent on the world cooperating with us. And bear these things in mind when we evaluate the successes of programs. So that is my introduction to speaking about this plan. There are some specific things that I would like to get to in the plan. We have 1 to 164, points 1 to 164. As I said, this is quite expansive. And I took the time just to note the things in this BERT plan that stood out to me. Not because they are bad, necessarily, but because I have questions about them. Because I have noticed that most of the discussion is about debt. Most of the discussion is about debt, it is about growth, it is about these economic elements of the plan. This is reasonable, but there is so much more in this plan that I wonder how these things will work, if they will work, and also the rationale. What's the reason behind them? So I note, for instance, a data analytics authority and national statistics system is supposed to come out of, this is one of the things to be implemented out of this plan. What is the connection between this and the Barbados Statistical Service? Are these two things is this going to replace the Barbados Statistical Service and therefore it will become redundant? What is this? I am not quite understanding. I know it is part of public sector reform that is to come from this program, but we have the Statistics Act Cap 192 that governs the Barbados Statistical Service. I am trying to figure out how these two things are connected and what the utility of this is. Would we not be expecting that the Barbados Statistical Service will be moving into the continuing to move along in the 21st century and thereby would incorporate things such as data analytics? Is this data analytics authority specifically to deal with BERT, or is this expected to be an ongoing and long-standing institution in Barbados that will help us to provide information that we need for development purposes as well? We need the statistics, we need the information so that we can track how we are doing and do better. I also note at 35, in speaking of state-owned enterprises, there is an emphasis on divesting from purely commercial activities, decreasing subsidies to the public via the introduction of user fees, decreasing subsidies to the public sector. I have some questions about these things too. What entities are we? There are some entities that we know of specifically. So we know that there are things that are going to happen with the Transport Board, Caribbean Broadcasting Corporation, National Housing Commission, RDC, UDC. But what else are we talking about here? I really would like just to have some more information on how these things are going to work. When we talk about user fees, where are these user fees going to come and what are they going to look like? Will something be built into these user fees to ensure that those who really cannot afford it, it is okay to say that we will have user fees, but at what level will these fees be? We don't want to end up in a situation where we introduce user fees that can undermine some of our institutions that people can use and experience free at the point of delivery. So we don't want to move into a situation where persons decide, you know what, I'm not going to take my child to the polyclinic, or I'm not going to go because I ain't really got that $10 in a user fee. My question is, where are these user fees going to come? Are we talking about them in the healthcare sector? Are we talking in schools? Where are the user fees? These are specifically state-owned enterprises. We know the QEH is supposed to be turned into a charity. Just what kind of user fees are we talking about? I really would like to know, and I hope that sufficient consideration is given to having these at an affordable level. Even when we're talking about things like registering businesses, we are interested in small businesses. All of these user fees, I would hope, are at levels that are really affordable or appropriate, let's say, appropriate to what people who may use the various entities can pay. CBC, for instance, there are some persons that, if not for CBC, they would not have any news or any form of television entertainment. Are we talking about a user fee in the form of what we see in other places, like a television license as exists in the United Kingdom? These are just some questions that I have. 62. This one, where there's a discussion about how arrears have been settled using bonds. This is something that concerns me. Arrears being settled using bonds, Series J bonds, Series F bonds, also at 63. Liabilities for properties that were compulsorily acquired, being repaid or addressed via bonds. Are people able to use these bonds to do the things that they need in life, like go to the supermarket with a bond or deal with other debts that they themselves might have? So I just sought here to point out some of the things that I want more information on. And I know that this is a broad plan, as it is a development plan. So I hope that in the future we will get more details on some of these things, and not just details proclaimed from on high, but that entail a level of engagement with those who may be affected, who may be the persons that have to pay user fees, for instance. The persons who have had to accept bonds, I don't know if they were consulted on this matter. I hope that in this process, those who are affected will be included. One of the things I really like is the discussion of the agricultural sector at 122 as a key driver of growth and food security. I like this, and I'm sure that Senator Brathwaite also likes this emphasis. Also, 139, the establishment of a regional ferry service for the movement of goods and people. I think this is a positive initiative, and I hope that it will come to reality. But there is one in here that, I don't know, it seems a little bit strange to me, and this is at 140C, the development of a legal and fiscal framework that will support the private development of new offshore islands and peninsulas. That is something. And I say this because there's so much in this document that talks about climate change. It talks about biological diversity and the blue economy. We have bonds for the blue economy. We know that there are initiatives in place that seek, via the debt swap, for instance, for us to preserve, to have preservation areas. And yet we talk about building these offshore islands. These can be useful for tourism and probably for other things. However, there's very little that I can find to suggest that these can be built in a way that is sustainable and in a way that does not harm marine biological diversity. There are things that I have read that can reduce the damage, but the amount of dredging that is necessary and the concrete and so on that is necessary to build these islands is highly environmentally destructive. And in a place such as ours, small island developing state, low-lying, where we are concerned about sea level rise, are we looking to create islands that are going to be drowned in 20 or 30 years? I'm very concerned about this. I'm concerned about the use of resources and the same investment that we are trying to attract for this, because I am not convinced that this can be done in a way that is very mindful of the marine environment, and not enough is known as yet about the longer-term implications of offshore islands that have been built around the world for coastlines, what they will do 30 or 40 years from now, we do not know. And as a small place, just 166 square miles, if this goes wrong, we don't have any place else to go. So we are not like China, for instance, that when they build offshore islands and something may go wrong along the coastline, people could go to a different part of China. You know, we are small. So I am very concerned about this, and I hope that a lot of care and attention is placed in building this, because I think this is a dangerous initiative. As attractive and lucrative as it may be, when we're thinking about development, it cannot just be about growth and investment and attracting any kind of growth and any kind of investment that is potentially lucrative. Cutting off your nose to spite your face, as Bajans might say. Independence is this month, so I feel like I use a little Bajanism in there. And there's a lot more. There is so much more in this document. I hope that people will refer to it. I really am impressed by the amount of emphasis placed on climate change, climate financing, 150 to 155. But again, this seems very contradictory if we are going to have this initiative at 140C. I also like the fact that there is a table at the end of this that lays out timelines for when things are to occur. And we have initiatives in place for monitoring. So this allows us, not just those who are responsible for building out this plan, to look and see how we are really doing, not how people say we are doing, because there are certain elements that we want to talk about. As I said, there's so much emphasis on debt reduction and how it has been reduced. But these other elements that I think are the really tricky parts of this program, dealing with state-owned enterprises and bringing the long-awaited, year after year, decade after decade, touted public sector reform that will bring us some efficiencies out of the many inefficiencies, including the financial ones. These are the things that I hope that we can achieve, and I hope that the timelines that we have in there can be adhered to. Finally, I want to end by saying that in addition to achieving these targets, I would love to know that at the end of this BERT program, we see people's lives improve. Because it is all well and good to say that we have met specific targets, but if people are still concerned that they cannot pay the light bill, they can't pay the water bill, they can't send their children to school, and we have not seen true economic diversification, what actually is the point of the BERT program? Is the point to attract investment and so on so that the numbers look good and that people's lives are not changed, because it can look nice on paper. We've dealt with, IMF, it's my fiscal, that's what they say, right? So we've dealt with the fiscal, but what about the physical lives of people? And I hope that this will remain at the center of this, even while we focus on the many laudable targets and aspirations, ambitions included in this BERT program. I don't want to leave without reiterating how concerned I am about anything that seeks to build offshore islands. Any initiative that seeks to build an offshore island off of Barbados, I think will be extremely harmful, lucrative as it might be. I think this is one area that perhaps should be put on ice until we do some very deep searching with a lot of scientific inquiry, using experts from the region and other places around the world where they have built these islands, because I think this is potentially dangerous. On balance, I am generally supportive of the BERT plan, and I hope that it will be successful. But I do want to ask that we temper some of the perhaps overselling of this program, so that people really understand that this is not a magic bullet. This is a medium term, in my opinion, development plan that may work in some areas and not work in others because of the environment in which we operate. Mr. President, I'm obliged to you.
Thank you very much, Senator Dr. Hines. Speakers? If no speakers, I'll ask.
Sorry,
Senator Dr.
thank you, Mr. President, for recognizing me. I had prepared 18 pages of notes. As you know, the BERT plan is a pretty extensive document, committed several days to reading and researching and preparing my speech. And as I sat next to Senator King, I had that screen of death, and my brother in Miami was actually trying to remotely access my laptop to retrieve my notes, but unfortunately that didn't work out. But as one of a handful of members who were here for the laying of the original debt plan back in, BERT plan back in 2018, I still thought it necessary that I should try to pull my thoughts together and to make a contribution on this resolution because of the significance and because of what it means for us, not only as a government, but as a nation. Back in 2018, when we came to office, many people flogged and lambasted the government because of what they call the default that we took 1 week after coming to office. That was what they call a selective default, where 1 week into coming to office, the government basically said we're in a position where we have skyrocketing debt, 176% of GDP, at that time the third most indebted country in the world. Our foreign exchange levels were at 4 weeks of import cover. We didn't have access to the international capital markets following 23 downgrades. We had a situation where there was negligible economic growth for the better part of 10 years. I think on average it said that the economic growth levels were around 0.5%, pulling all this from memory, and deficits averaged around 7% during that 10-year period. That had real impacts on the lives of everyday people. It had real impacts on our infrastructure, access to services. Many would recall around at the halfway point during that 10-year period, we saw the loss of access to university education. I suspect that actually coincided with around the time that we didn't have access to the international capital markets. Everybody would remember there was an issue related to money printing, where we were relying on central bank financing to keep the country standing. We were forcing the NAS to buy government paper to keep things going because there was no growth. Nobody wanted government paper because the downgrades had us just one rank above default, and yet everybody acts surprised that, 1 week in, a government in its infancy had to come to the table and make a decision, a wise decision in my belief, to go through the process of what you call selective default rather than having the market force you to default. What a selective default allows you to do is to bring your creditors to the table and say, hey, Houston, we have a problem. This is not a debt issue, a fiscal issue, a foreign exchange issue of our making, but we are taking the prerogative to fix this issue so that we can get back on a stable footing and hopefully be in a position to grow from there. So just to lay that foundation, in the first week of coming to office, that is where we found ourselves. The resolution in 2018 came to Parliament in October, so just over 4 years ago. And I remember at the time, it was one of the first bills that we had that came to divide. You could imagine, at the time, obviously, it was a very heated debate, very, very contentious, and we didn't get a whole lot of support from the other side at the time, but the resolution did pass. And I was actually quite grateful to see that at the end of the day, the proof was in the pudding. BERT delivered on the parameters that it said that it would. And so saying, I'm talking about the fact that at the time we had domestic arrears to the tune of $1.9 billion. And we talk about things like arrears and debt as if they're abstract terms. When I talk about arrears, I mean the government of the day owed local businesses, owed Barbadians who were not getting personal income tax refunds, who were not getting corporate income tax refunds, who were not seeing VAT refunds. I remember in 2019, I received sickness benefits from a sickness claim that I filed in 2015 to show you how, when we talk about these arrears, this 1.9 billion, it sounds so abstract, but that affected how people could live. Disability benefits weren't being paid out. People weren't seeing NAS refunds that they were counting on to be able to do things. And worse than that, the same access to tertiary education that was touted previously was removed by the administration that former Prime Minister, God bless him, belonged to. And we reinstated that. Prior to BERT, this government took the initiative to front load the program with a number of initiatives. I remember around the time the Prime Minister used to say, we're going to be going on a long walk and I'm going to give you something to eat first. And you know what we prioritized? We increased public servants' wages across the board. We increased non-contributory pensions to make sure that old ladies could eat. We also, during the course, even through the course of the IMF program, we increased minimum wage. A lot of people forget that a lot of the work that we did that impacts the lives of everyday people and poor people too. Raised the minimum wage in the middle of an IMF program. Reinstated the same university access. So when it comes to BERT, when we really look at it, by I believe the end of 2018, the debt rates, I think they fall by like about 83%, obviously, and we were registering surpluses by the end of the financial year. I believe we reached our 6% target at one point, and we reached 3.5% in another year. Obviously, I don't have access to all of my notes, but at the end of the day, BERT 1 delivered on what was promised. No one could see COVID coming. COVID, as much as we say the pandemic is behind us, and we were referring to a post-pandemic era, the effects of it lingered. At the height of the pandemic, around March, April 2020 or so, during the lockdowns, they said unemployment, in this same BERT document, they said that unemployment around that time was averaging around 40%. 40%. So when I say we could have been in a totally different place without the crises that Senator Cummings would have made reference to. But I just wanted to briefly say that just based on the fact that we didn't have a lot of people, some members and members of the general public, members of this House, members of the public at the time, couldn't see where we were going with it. But at the end of the day, I am here as a member who was here then and who's here now to say that because it worked, and because I could see the results and the benefits of it, that I am here to proudly support BERT Part 2, because I know that this team was able to deliver then, and I hope that we can do it again. I'm really excited about things, including the thrust for agribusiness, the talk about developing the logistics hub and the Atlantic Bridge. I noticed only yesterday, Antigua Airways, they launched their own airline and had an inaugural flight from, was it Lagos? Lagos to Antigua. So the Caribbean is really committed to building this out. And, you know, sure, we're Barbadians, we're talking about the Barbadian context, but to see Antigua achieve that, to see the partnerships that and the collaboration that we're seeing with Guyana, with Suriname, and with northern Brazil in terms of shoring up food security, this has a direct impact on the cost of living as well. Because the worst of all the cost of living crisis to me is the food inflation. I can tell you, my son eats Cheerios every morning. We normally get the big double bag Cheerios, normally $29. I went in the supermarket this week. Cheerios are $40, an $11 jump just in a matter of 2 or 3 weeks. So these initiatives are going to have real impacts on the lives of everyday people. There's a continued emphasis on education, retraining, even for people who were displaced during the earlier BERT program. And I remember a previous central bank governor had made reference to the fact that labor should shoulder the burden of the restructuring and suggested that around 6,500 people should be sent home in order to get things back on even keel. And rather than taking that sledgehammer approach, We were able to find other ways to cut and to restructure and to reprioritize so that people would not be sent home. I think ultimately the labor statistics indicate that around 1,100 people were sent home. And even then, you might remember the program where people were retrained, retooled so that they could be deployed into other areas. And I think one of the best ones that I saw was where the transport board workers that were laid off were enrolled in the transport augmentation program. Many of those men have bought buses and started co-ops where they're supporting entities like Ross University and so on, and have been able to become entrepreneurs in their own right. So the reality in the context of COVID, in the context of hurricanes and all the other things that we've been facing, we've been still trying to make sure that people can live. But we live in a time of war, in a time of global realities. A lot of things are out of our control. But I can see through this document a commitment to making sure that we get our debt situation under control and that we are positioned for growth. And all of this, as Dr. Hines referenced, should be people-centered. I really, really commend her for that point. And I think that we can deliver on this because I know we've done it before. So that's my brief contribution, Mr. President. Thanks for recognizing me.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hayes. Speakers? Senator Cummins.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And I want to express the appreciation of the government for all of the comments which were received in the contributions from the honorable members of the Senate, starting with Senator Andrea Boyce and followed on with Senator Dr. Charleston Brathwaite, and then on to Senator Drakes, and finally Dr. Hines. I want to and finally, Dr. Haynes as well, who despite having lost her notes, and I know she is usually meticulously prepared, I know that that is something that it took a great effort for her to then stand and deliver nonetheless. But I want to take a few moments to attempt on behalf of the government to respond to some of the queries that were raised in the respective interventions, to provide further information, or in some instances to provide clarity. Now, there were two contributions where Senator Andrea Boyce and Senator Drakes both spoke about issues relating to port efficiency, issues relating to trade facilitation, issues relating to persons reporting challenges in getting clearances. And I want to take a minute to break that down because obviously, as you rightly said, I would have navigated many of those issues as chairman of the port, subsequently as minister with responsibility for the port, and now I'm navigating it in a different context as minister with responsibility for trade and trade facilitation. So I want to pull those things together with some context. Now, when you say people are complaining about the length of time that it takes to clear goods, I want us to break that down. The port receives all different kinds of goods on any given day. On my phone, every Sunday for the last year, and before as chairman, it was something that I introduced, I can see a report that comes to my phone that tells me all the merchandise items that Senator Drakes is speaking about that have arrived on island by container load. I can tell you with a glance of my phone how many containers have arrived, and I can map how long they have remained in the port and where the issues are all through the chain. I can tell you if they have just landed and they have landed with 0 days. I can tell you if they have been released by customs, if they have not been released by customs. I can tell you if they are awaiting input information from the broker, and then I can tell you what is there over a 12-day period and who it belongs to. That is the kind of data that the port uses to track its port efficiency operations for containers. And that's 20-foot containers and 40-foot containers. The system that I had introduced when I was chairman of the port was that on Friday afternoons, come what may, we met every Friday to review what containers were in the port. If a container remained in the port for 3 days, it was elevated to the CEO. If it remained in the port for 5 days, it was elevated to the chair, because we then had to be able to assess why a container, usually assigned to a commercial importer, not an individual, a commercial importer most times, why it was still in the port. And the tail is an interesting one that would surprise many people. Oftentimes, 80% of the issues with a container not being released relate to the non-input of data from a broker. Oftentimes, you have information that is inaccurately entered into the system. Oftentimes, depending on what the declaration has been on that item, it is incorrectly declared and it has been sent back for review. In other instances, depending on what is actually declared in the manifest, it may need secondary inspection, because it's not just the port taking a container off of a ship via a crane and customs releasing it. Depending on what is in that container, there may be a need for clearance by agriculture. There may be a clearance by health. There may be a clearance by veterinary health. And if you, for example, are importing dog food and you only say rice or grain, there's nothing in the system that may differentiate between that being dog food and for human consumption, and it is going to be flagged for further inspection. So there are any number of reasons sometimes why there may be a delay. There may be a delay in clearances in the first instance, and most of them are input errors. You would have heard the Minister with day-to-day responsibility for Customs, Minister Strong, speak about input errors being behind a lot of the challenges that we experienced in September 2019, which is why when Senator Drakes was speaking, I knew exactly the time frame, because September 2019 was when we introduced the Asakuda World System. And when we introduced the Asakuda World System, I had the, I don't know, you call it the privilege or the burden of co-chairing a joint task force with the Comptroller of Customs to oversee the duration of that implementation through September, and worse yet, at high season for cargo coming into the country, heading into Christmas. And 90% of the errors that were experienced and the transitionary challenges that we faced with Asakuda World were as a result of input errors. People who were used to putting in a zero where they didn't see a number, or people who were putting in a full stop, a point, where it wasn't there, or numbers that did not correspond, and so they added on zeros to fill in empty slots. And despite an extensive period of training, you found that it took a period of transition, and it happened from September through December of 2019. Now, why that is important, Mr. President, is because of this. And I say this, I don't know if I ever said it publicly, but I say it now. When we started that process in September, and the Customs Department was introducing Asakuda World, there was obviously a shift to the utilization of technology. COVID then started to set in February of 2020. And in January of 2020, from the September through January period, September 2019 through January 2020, the port had purchased on behalf of all of the government agencies that have a responsibility for regulatory clearances in the port, tablets that would have allowed for the seamless integration of Asakuda both in on-site inspections and off-site inspections. Those laptops were never opened until the first quarter of 2020. Those tablets were never opened in our central government agencies until 2020, because people were used to the big blue books that they had always been using and writing things in, well, and it takes time and change management for these things to evolve. But COVID was a good disruptor in that way, because people who did not want to default to the technology and use risk management to improve port efficiency didn't want to go outside anymore, didn't want to touch things anymore, didn't want to be in on-site inspections anymore, and so technology took over. And so for the purpose of containers and break bulk cargo, there has been a significant transition in the turnaround time. Now, when it comes to personal effects cargo, the barrels and the boxes that come from members of the diaspora and want to ship that back home. Now, I've heard some of the concerns about the system and the technology, but you know, when you say A, you have to say B. When that system with the utilization of technology was introduced, I still was chairman of the port. And it was introduced at the time, Mr. President, because the period during which we had to make those decisions was when the country was in lockdown. But we also understood the social impact that many people in this chamber have spoken about today, because there were people who were not working. There were people who were in their homes and could not come outside and did not have access to the kind of retail opportunities and shopping and so on. And families in New York and elsewhere were sending barrels and boxes home to help support their families in lockdown. But at the same time, people didn't want to interact. The historical notion of people gathering in Shed 2 in the port and coming and going as they will did not exist when the system was introduced, Mr. President, but people still needed to get their goods. And so the system of using a technological platform was designed for the purpose of ensuring that we could work with the truckers who function in the port, we could work with the brokers that function in the port, and together create a mechanism that allowed poor people especially to have the benefit of their barrels and their boxes without having to come out and being exposed in Shed 2 to COVID-19, and conversely, have port workers equally exposed to COVID-19 because they too, just like everybody else in Barbados, were concerned. So sometimes it really just requires us to understand context in order to agree to understand conclusions that were reached. Over time, that system evolved, and I expect it to continue to evolve. But included in this BERT program, you have references to not just the expansion of port efficiency and trade facilitation, but it also makes reference to and incorporates the expansion of ASACUDA, as started in 2019, to the inclusion of the maritime single window, which is currently already in operation now, which integrates the ship side of things, to incorporate the electronic single window, which now falls under my ministry, which is a trade facilitation mechanism that falls under the World Trade Organization, World Customs Organization, and UNCTAD as well. And then that is all being built into a port community system, which then takes the technology to a new level. So all of these are parts of the ambitious agenda that was just described in the government, and many of them are already in operation. ASACUDA World is in operation, the Maritime Single Window is in operation, the ESW is under development in collaboration with UNCTAD, and the port community system is under development in collaboration with the Caribbean Development Bank. So that is the response to the question on port efficiency and trade facilitation, and the expectation is that we will continue. My ministry now already has a trade facilitation committee. I've always had my views on the trade facilitation committee, and I expect that now, using my experiences in the port and watching how the Port Efficiency Subcommittee has navigated issues relating to port and trade efficiency, that those things will now come to bear in the future direction of the National Trade Facilitation Committee that monitors Barbados' implementation of the trade facilitation agreement under the World Trade Organization. And I say that as someone who, while I was based in Uganda, had the privilege of being one of the negotiators on behalf of East Africa at the time of the trade facilitation agreement itself. So it is my intention to make sure that we do everything we can to be efficient and to reduce costs. Now, do we have the specialized skills and capacity to execute the government's ambitious program and agenda? It was an important and a relevant question asked by Senator Drakes. Now, I have to confess I'm going to give a bit of a tongue-in-cheek answer, Senator Drakes, but then I'm going to answer it seriously. I give a tongue-in-cheek answer, Senator Drakes, because this is the same administration that, in addition to the challenges that we accept on one hand with skills and capacity and public sector reform, has taken a ton of blows for recruiting consultants with specialist skills. We've done exactly that and taken blows for exactly that. For this very reason, do we have the capacity and the skills to execute the programs that we need? And in some instances, internal to central government, we do not always have those skills. And if we were to make a decision that we were going to move forward with an aggressive agenda, I say it, and I think the Prime Minister has said it on more than one occasion, we could not have completed the debt restructuring program with the foreign creditors and the domestic creditors monitored and implemented BERT 2018, designed and now preparing to implement BERT 2022 without the likes of the skills of specialists like Dr. Kevin Greenidge from the IMF, who has been on borrowed to us for the last several years. Those are the kinds of specialist skills that we have brought in. We could not have designed a lot of the development programs without the skills of specialists like Professor Avinash Prasad, who has come in. We could not have done so without the likes of Dr. Clyde Maskell and those types of persons who have constituted the specialist skills to develop programming. Now, Ben Arundel, for example, who I'm sure, Mr. President, you are no stranger to, who passed just a few months ago, has been a stellar example of the kinds of specialist skills in tax that we don't have internal to central government. We could not have done a lot of the work that we did on the harmful tax initiatives and on the OECD initiatives, for which I am now responsible under the international business portfolio, if we did not buy in the types of specialist skills like Ben Arundel, all of this type, and others like him. So yes, I think the government has demonstrated that for some things, we will have to walk the public through the rationale for buying in specialist skills, for being able to reach out into the international community where appropriate, and finding those skills and those niches in order to ensure that we can meet the ambitious agenda that we have set. So the answer, in short, to Senator Drake through you, Mr. President, is yes. We will make sure that we have the specialist skills. Now, has education plateaued? I think that the Ministry of Education has outlined that there is to be education sector reform. It is, in my mind, a long overdue reality, and I have always said publicly that before we even get to the tertiary level, issues relating to our primary curriculum, issues relating to the transition from primary to secondary, issues relating to the secondary transition, because the question cannot only be about what happens at university, which arguably is close to the end of the life cycle, or what happens at age 11, which is the transitional phase from primary to secondary. It has to be a much broader and a more holistic conversation. And the government of Barbados is committed and has said so to that broader and more holistic conversation about education sector reform. But education sector reform for this administration goes well beyond the University of the West Indies and employability of students on the University of the West Indies. I was having a discussion with a private sector entity this week, and we were discussing under my ministry, the work being done in the private sector to support the development of commerce. And in working with the Barbados Coalition of Service Industries, I said to them during the course of this week, I believe it was yesterday morning in my meeting with them, there has to be an evolution that says Barbados as a nation is prioritizing education in the traditional academic disciplines. There has to be an evolution that says Barbados is diversifying the traditional disciplines into non-traditional sub-disciplines. 500 students coming out of the University of the West Indies every single year with medical science degrees, and all of them want to be clinicians. But how do we then rationalize the balance between the important work being done by clinicians and the research work that is critical to support research and development as a part of our development agenda? How do we look at the new and the emerging disciplines that are there to be able to expand the scope of what is being offered in a University of the West Indies, for example, beyond medical sciences into specialized disciplines and globally as well? How do we support the opportunities that are to be made available, even with specialized discipline? We have lawyers. How many legal students come out of the University of the West Indies? Senator Boyce would have to tell me, I am not sure, but, or Senator Nichols, but we only hear of a limited number of sub-disciplines or specializations that they go into. What are the new skills and opportunities to take us into new and diversified paths within our traditional disciplines? So the question of whether or not we have plateaued is both an internal and an external question. It is about whether or not we have actually taken full advantage of the technical and vocational training opportunities that then create an equal platform for people who are plumbers and masons and artisans who are in some instances earning higher than those with a university qualified degree. How do we say to people that they are equal and not less than, and create an education system and a society that recognizes that equivalence and then seeks to elevate them into not just the earning capacity, but into the recognition that they deserve? Has education plateaued? I think that when we get through education sector reform and we have a conversation with ourselves as a nation also about the things that we think are important and the people we think are important and those that are not, I think that will help to answer the question on whether or not education has plateaued. Now, planning for crises. I want to be personal about this. I joined the Senate in 2018. I became chairman of the port in the same year of 2018. I joined the cabinet in July of 2020. And I've shifted portfolios exactly a week ago today. Over the life cycle of my own journey in this administration, unless you've lived it, unless you've walked it, I promise you, you cannot imagine it. Prime Minister used to say this was a war cabinet. Before I joined and in the 2018 to 2019 period when we were dealing with fiscal crises, I remember hearing stories or sometimes going about my business and driving up government headquarters, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock in the night, sometimes the wee hours in the morning, and cabinet ministers' cars were still parked out in front of government headquarters because cabinet was still in session. It was a war cabinet then. I have not, since I came to government, had a vacation. I got married one day, I was back to work next. I have not had a day off. Many of my colleagues in cabinet can say the same thing. If we don't have, even though we had to come to Parliament to make sure we could get vacation, we haven't had the opportunity to take vacation. Many of us. I know I can speak for myself. There was always some reason why you couldn't go off. And that's not something to hold up as a badge of honor at all, because there has to be that balance. But the truth of the matter is, if there is a group of people who I think practice on a day-to-day basis sober reflection and war principles, it is the cabinet in which I serve. If it is a group of people who understand the exogenous risks that we have faced year on year on year on year, it is the government within which I serve. If it is a group of people, it is the public officials who have had to walk, lock, and step in hand with us every step of the way, all hours of the night, all hours of the day. We have meetings now as a result of Zoom that start at 6 o'clock in the evening. We're accustomed to going home and feeding the dogs and carrying them for a walk and stuff like that. Pre-COVID, when you leave work. 4:30 traffic is a misery. Many of us are still in our offices until night. Saturday, we will have, I had a person call me on Saturday, Lisa, what is your schedule? We want to have a meeting on Saturday afternoon at 1 o'clock. Okay, no problem, but I have one at 10 o'clock on Saturday morning too. So it meant that while people are out doing their regular business of taking their kids to dance and going to the supermarket, we are in meetings. We serve in a government that lives, breathes, and eats sober reflection. Trust me when I say that, because that's all we have navigated. We have not had the luxury of not being sober about the issues before us as a country, because every decision taken is our responsibility. Every decision not taken is our responsibility. Every decision we agree with is our responsibility, and every decision we don't agree with is still our responsibility. So we live it every day because the people of Barbados deserve that from us in the moment in which we are all navigating. They do. And that is why we are here today. Now, there's a question on whether or not that will be the case going forward. Absolutely. There's a level of commitment that I see among the government service and my colleagues that I expect to continue because the journey is not done. The public service, officials, the political class, we are staying the course. It is not an easy thing, but I can give you the commitment that on the implementation of the BERT, implementation deficits notwithstanding, because I know we have that, not just in Barbados, but all across the CARICOM region. The CARICOM region is awash with reports and papers and studies and plans and programs and projects that have never been implemented. But the urgency of now, to use a CARICOM phrase in this instance, is what we have before us, certainly as a government. Now, what will happen with the BSS and what about this Data Analytics Authority? The Ministry of Innovation, Science and Technology has started a program of digitization of our records, and that program continues ministry by ministry, but that is just saving of files and records that in some instances are dated. For those of you who are economists, for instance, or those of you who are into development and those of you who are into planning, the question is, how do our systems talk to each other? So if it is in the Ministry of Energy and Business, but unless the Ministry of Culture, the Minister and the Prime Minister's office is also able to access cross-government information, then the digitization has not yet fully served its purpose. And so we have to be able to assimilate information. And I'll give you one example to make the case. Yesterday, someone called me about an issue in my ministry to talk about import licenses for trade import licenses. And they said, oh, well, this entity applies for the exemptions under the legislation for your former ministry under the Tourism Development Act. And they're eligible to get it from the Tourism Development Act. But they say that the information that used to come from that ministry can't come to us. You have to get new correspondence. That's frustrating in public, right? So data analytics requires that across government has a holistic way of not only storing data, retrieving data, analyzing data, and being able to make public services far more effective. We don't do a good job of that sometimes, but we have to. On the question of the Series J bonds for persons who have had things like land compulsorily acquired, those are paid on the basis of the legislation of 2021 in 42 equal installments. So it is not a mechanism whereby you get a bond, you hold on to it from time immemorial, 10 years, 20 years. Series J bonds for lands, for example, compulsorily acquired, you get a payment every single month for 42 months based on the schedule outlined in the legislation Act 2021. And then finally, on artificial islands, I believe there's at least one other member in this chamber who may have some knowledge on the extensive body of work done by international partner BERT. I believe it was in 2019, 2020. I believe the report was completed and submitted in 2020. BERT is an international entity that does a considerable body of work all over the globe on environmental impact and coastal surveys. Again, a commitment to buying in the best international specialist skills where there is a capacity deficit on island. And that considerable body of work explored the possibility of the establishment of artificial islands off of Barbados. We didn't guess it. We didn't ask anyone locally to do it without expertise. We did use that firm because we needed to draw absolutely on the best practice examples and the experiences of countries around the world. And the report that is in the possession of the government outlines what the prospects are, it outlines the risks, and it outlines the potential costs. Now, when the government first came to office in 2018, this was one of the agenda items which was on our manifesto. It still remains one of the agenda items because it is a futuristic policy, even if we do not have the fiscal space in a 2022 to do it. What I can say to you is that this administration has a number of critical priorities on which domestic expenditure can and should be based. Domestic expenditure on artificial islands is not one of the things that this government can commit to, because there's the opportunity cost as to what else it means that we can't spend on. But what I can say is that as it relates to investment, an investor who is coming to invest in a hotel is not the same investor, neither is that the same investor of skill that will invest in an artificial island. Far from it. The two are very, very different categories because the volume of capital injection that you're talking about for an artificial island and all the EIA work that goes into it is certainly not an equivalent investment that will take investment away from things which are significantly smaller in scale and capital injection. So I want to give the assurance that government revenues will not go into an artificial island investment, neither will an artificial island investment, if there is such a thing at any point in the future, neither will it take away from existing types of investment because they are not they're almost apples and oranges in some instances. In terms of user fees, I'm just seeing that I had a note here, I just want to make sure I covered it properly, user fees. I think government in Barbados, this administration has been very clear on the expenditure on social services. And this is where I want to end, where Senator Brathwaite, Dr. Brathwaite, I was actually leaving him to the end because he was out of the room and I didn't want to address that, along with Senator Drake's as well on the question of social. So I left the user fees and then the question of social transformation to last. Mr. President, this is an administration that has spent a considerable amount of time and resources on social infrastructure. This has been an administration that, in a previous incarnation, under a former Prime Minister, created something called the Ministry of Social Transformation. This is an administration under this government that subsequently also created a Ministry of People's Empowerment and Elder Affairs, and a ministry, a government that has put its flagship, I don't want to call it flagship, but its principal social policy advisor. Minister Kirk Humphrey is the minister with responsibility for social care in this country, and I want to take just a nanosecond to explain to you why he is where he is. He is a sociology graduate of the University of the West Indies. I believe he's a social policy graduate of the London School of Economics and a public policy graduate of Harvard University. He is well skilled in his discipline and in his profession, and he is the responsible party for guiding this nation's social policy transformation. Mr. President, he, along with the immediate past minister with responsibility for People's Empowerment and Elder Affairs, Cynthia Ford, a member of Parliament in the other place, worked on a committee in the last cabinet to establish a social policy transformation framework whereby they then developed a people-centered development agenda, which is based on a number of planks and the complete reform of the current social welfare infrastructure. My expectation, and I don't want to preempt that work when they are going to be speaking to it, but my expectation is that the work that they have already done on our institutional reform is designed to lend itself to the kind of social reform and transformation and the people-centered approach that has been called for, and rightly so, by Senator Dr. Brathwaite and Senator Haynes, Senator Drake's as well. And I give the commitment that whether it is in housing programs and ensuring that people are not being just given homes to go and live in without having skin in the game, but tying that to the home energy program, the HOPE program, so that you're able to rent to own, or you're able to get connected to the renewable energy reform by also having home ownership, that you are able to take advantage of the democratization of renewable energy. All of those mechanisms are designed to ensure affordability, inclusion, equity, and ultimately transformation, and we hope the elimination of poverty, if not the eradication of poverty over time. Mr. President, this has been a considerable debate, and I want to again thank all of the honourable members who have spoken. And with these few words, I hope that I have answered the questions raised by the honourable members to the government on the implementation of the program, and I beg to move that this resolution do now pass.
Thank you very much, Senator Cummins. The question is that this resolution to take note and approve the Barbados Economic Recovery and Transformation Plan 2022-2023, the 26-27 do now pass. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. Resolution is now passed. Cummins.
Thank you, Mr. President. I beg to move the adjournment of today's sitting of the Senate, but I wish to, before doing so, advise honorable senators that we are potentially looking to meet on November 16th and November 23rd. We will get notices confirming those dates in due course from the clerks, from the Parliament Secretariat. But, Mr. President, I beg to move that we don't do adjourn sine die with that clarification.
Senator Dr. Hines.
Thank you, Mr. President. I just had a question about a procedural question, and that relates to the suspension of Standing Order 45-2. I am curious as to why that standing order was suspended, because it does not seem to have been required, and whether we are continually in the practice of suspending that standing order that gives us at least 5 days to look at legislation before us for a particular reason. Why each time we meet, we suspend that standing order.
Senator Cummins.
Thank you, Mr. President. The use of Article 45(2), usually based on the standing orders, is meant to allow us to do a bill in all its stages, notwithstanding timeframes in between. As you would recall today, the discussion initially was potentially to have at least one other bill, of which notice was given only today. But given the lateness of the hour, we've made the determination that it would not be fair to honourable senators to introduce a first reading bill of that third item, and we would instead leave it to the next sitting. So the item that you would have been advised of informally will not now come today, and that would have been the basis for the use initially at the outset of the sitting for 45(2) being suspended.
Senator Dr. Hines.
Thank you for that, but I am still not understanding why each time we meet, we suspend that standing order. So is it that we no longer require this standing order that gives us 5 days between the first reading, at least 5 days between the first reading and the next? Because since I have been in this place, we have not used it. So I'm really trying to understand the conduct of business. Should we expect that we go straight from first to second reading each time? Or will we at some point actually use the standing orders as they are listed?
Go ahead. Senator Cummins.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. President. Just to say that we don't actually always suspend 45-2, but what is also interesting in this instance is that for bills being notified and notice being given in the other place, we always at the same time ensure that all senators have the bills at the same time that they are laid in the other place, making sure that you have access to the bills not when they are passed, but at the time that notice is given in the other place. So the distance of time that you have access to the bill in all instances is well before Senate meets and well in excess of 5 days at all times.
Thank you very much. Anyone speaking in the adjournment? Okay, the question before us then, having exhausted all matters, speaking on the adjournment, the question is that this sitting be now adjourned, sign it aye. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. Senate stands adjourned.